Avery Bennett never asked to be the center of a political firestorm. As a queer humanitarian delegate, they came to Geneva to present research and save lives. But when a powerful diplomat tried to silence them, Avery made a choice to speak anyway, erased from the program, locked out of rooms, threatened without paper trails. But Avery didn't flinch. Their quiet resistance sparked international support, a congressional investigation, and a global reckoning inside the world of diplomacy. This is a story about courage, documentation, and what happens when one voice refuses to disappear. Would you have spoken up in Avery's place? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful true-to-life stories that matter. A soft mist hovered over the tarmac as the chartered U.S. diplomatic jet touched down in Geneva. Just beyond the glass of the shuttle bus, towering banners flapped in the wind outside the Palais des Nations, bearing the bold logo of the International Summit on Human Rights and Civil Protections. For Dr. Avery Bennett, it was more than just another stop on a crowded itinerary. It was a milestone. Avery, an openly queer liaison for a humanitarian NGO contracted by the U.S. State Department, had spent the last 7 years advocating for displaced communities, with a special focus on LGBTQ+ refugees. They weren't new to tense policy tables or bureaucratic mazes. But this conference, held in the hallowed halls of international diplomacy, marked the first time they were an official delegate. As Avery stepped onto the embassy vehicle, their ID badge clipped to a crisp navy blazer. They scanned the shuttle. A few familiar faces from state nodded in recognition. Across from them sat a man with a stiff posture and piercing blue eyes, his graying hair combed precisely. "Dr. Bennett," the man said, extending a gloved hand. "Philip Lancaster, Deputy Chief of Mission for the U.S. Embassy." Avery accepted the handshake, firm and brief. "A pleasure. Thank you for coordinating the logistics." "Of course," Lancaster replied with a thin smile. "Although I wasn't informed you'd be part of the U.S. delegate group until this morning. Communications mishap, I'm sure." It was the first crack, subtle, easily deniable, but unmistakably deliberate. Avery said nothing, keeping their posture neutral. They'd encountered this energy before, the type that hid contempt behind protocol. By late afternoon, the delegation had settled into the embassy's secured residence wing, a refurbished early 20th century villa overlooking Lake Geneva. Avery's room was modest but functional. They unpacked carefully: slacks, button-downs, a folder of printed remarks for their breakout session, and a slim leather-bound notebook filled with data and personal stories from the field. They took a moment to sit at the writing desk by the window, watching the lake ripple beneath gray skies. The air in Geneva always had a certain weight, diplomatic and literal. They knew what their presence meant here. Not just for their NGO, but for every queer refugee whose name they carried in their notes. Dinner was a formal affair in the embassy's reception hall, complete with foreign dignitaries, donors, and press liaisons. Lancaster gave a brief welcome toast, extolling the strength of American diplomacy and the importance of shared cultural values. He never once acknowledged Avery's presence. When it came time for Avery's introduction, it was done through another staffer, quick, almost as an afterthought. A few polite claps, a nod from someone across the table, but no real recognition. Later, during post-dinner mingling, a European delegate approached Avery, beaming. "Your work on trans-asylum policies in West Africa was absolutely brilliant. I hope you're speaking this week." "Yes," Avery replied. "Thursday afternoon, room D24. Behind them, Lancaster sipped a whiskey, watching silently. The next morning, as the delegation queued at the security checkpoint to enter the Palais, Avery's badge refused to scan. The red light blinked, the guard frowned. "I'm sorry, this credential isn't on today's clearance list." Avery blinked. "That's not possible. It was issued yesterday." The guard shrugged. "You'll need to speak with your mission coordinator." 20 minutes later, Lancaster arrived, clipboard in hand. He looked mildly irritated. "Dr. Bennett, I'm told your clearance was temporarily suspended due to a database flag. Nothing serious, just a systems thing. We'll get it sorted." "A flag for what?" "Probably a clerical error. You know how these systems are with third-party contractors." Avery held his gaze. "I'm not a contractor. I'm an official NGO liaison pre-approved by state." Lancaster smiled coolly. "Of course, still, we don't want to cause a scene. If you'll wait back at the residence, we'll send word when it's resolved." It took 2 full days. 2 days during which Avery's panels went unattended, their advocacy sessions reassigned, their notes excluded from briefing packets. No explanation, no apology, just silence. They spent those days reading over their presentations, annotating margins, adjusting slides, anything to keep their hands busy, but they also began a digital log on their tablet. Entry 1, badge failure. Time, place, guard name. Entry 2, missed panels, reassigned by whom. Entry 3, staff member from logistics refusing to answer questions. That night, Jess Morales, an old colleague now working for a European delegation, found Avery in the courtyard. That wasn't a glitch, she said. Lancaster, been in everyone's ear since Monday, said you were too activist for diplomacy. Said your presence was making things complicated. Avery felt a slow simmer rise in their chest. Not anger, resolve. They opened their notebook, turned to the first blank page, and began to write time, dates, witnesses, every procedural misstep. They would document everything because they had not come this far to be erased, not by Lancaster, not by the system that quietly protected him. The morning after Jess's warning, Avery woke early. Fog still clung to the edges of Lake Geneva, casting the city in a gray calm. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping tea, letting the stillness ground them, but beneath the stillness was focus. They weren't here to prove their worth. They had already done that. They were here to make sure the work got seen. By 8 o'clock, they had dressed sharply, clipped their badge on again, and packed their presentation materials into a sleek leather case. They knew they wouldn't be presenting that morning, not officially. Their slot had been reassigned, but the room was still listed on the schedule, which meant the attendees might still show up, and some of them did. Avery stood just outside room D24, offering printouts of their research to the small crowd that had gathered in confusion. There was no signage change, no notice of a cancellation. There was a scheduling issue, Avery told them calmly, but I'm happy to summarize the core findings for you here in the hallway if you'd like. Most stayed. For 20 minutes, Avery presented their work on LGBTQ plus refugee safety corridors using nothing but handouts and a tablet. It wasn't glamorous, but it was heard. A French delegate asked to share the data with their committee. A Ghanaian aid worker requested a digital copy. A young translator even recorded the talk and promised to upload it to a regional forum. Jess appeared halfway through, leaning against the far wall, arms crossed with a proud smirk. They didn't erase you, she said when the impromptu crowd dispersed. You just went off program. Back at the embassy, the atmosphere had changed. There was tension in the air, subtle but tangible. Staff members avoided eye contact. Lancaster was nowhere to be seen during the morning briefing. Instead, a junior officer distributed the updated schedule. Avery reviewed it. Their name wasn't listed anywhere. Later that afternoon, they approached the administrative desk. I'd like to know why I've been removed from the updated conference itinerary, they asked evenly. The staffer hesitated. I think those decisions came from upstairs. Then I'd like a formal explanation in writing. The staffer nodded nervously. I'll request that. That night, back in their room, Avery began compiling everything into a secure digital folder. Emails, messages, the revised itinerary, even screenshots of the original conference schedule. They backed it up twice, one copy on a secure drive, another encrypted in cloud storage. They also uploaded a summary of the hallway presentation to their NGO's internal platform, ensuring it reached their partners. Michelle Tang, a senior director at their NGO, called that evening. I've heard some whispers, she said. Is everything all right over there? Avery briefed her. Michelle exhaled sharply. Lancaster has a reputation, but he's politically protected. This will need to be handled carefully. I'll notify our legal team. Keep documenting. Don't engage directly unless necessary. The following morning, Avery returned to the Palais. This time the badge scanned without issue, but when they reached the main assembly floor, a security officer stepped in their path. Sorry. This area is closed to outside representatives for today's session. Internal delegates only. Avery glanced past him. Inside, Lancaster sat with other U.S. staff, whispering to a man from the British Foreign Office. Their eyes met briefly before Lancaster turned away. Outside in the cafe, Jess found Avery again. They're trying to tire you out, she said, make you disappear through exhaustion. It won't work, Avery replied. Jess leaned in. Then let's make noise, quiet noise. I'll help you get in front of the Nordic bloc. They've been pushing transparency reforms. If they see what's happening here, it won't stay hidden. Avery smiled, tight-lipped but determined. Let's do it. That afternoon, Avery met informally with delegates from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Jess provided introductions, framing it as an unscheduled discussion on field-based challenges to LGBTQ+ advocacy. Once seated, Avery laid out their observations. What I've experienced here isn't just personal friction, it's an institutional silencing of queer advocacy. If it can happen to someone on a US-sponsored ticket, it's happening elsewhere too. The Danish representative took notes. The Swedish official asked for documentation. And the Norwegian diplomat, older with sharp eyes and a quiet voice, asked one simple question. Are you prepared to go public? Avery didn't hesitate. If it means protecting future advocates, yes. When the meeting ended, they walked out of the cafe not as a sideline delegate but as a signal flare. And somewhere in the embassy, Philip Lancaster was likely beginning to feel the heat. Avery went back to their room that night and updated their digital log. There were now 16 entries. The resistance had begun, and it was anything but quiet. The next morning, the polished floors of the U.S. Embassy lobby reflected the rising sun through its tall, bulletproof windows. Avery moved through the halls with intention. Every step was recorded on security cameras. Every polite nod from a staffer was weighed for sincerity. Something had shifted, and not just around them. After their informal meeting with the Nordic bloc, word had spread, quietly but persistently. Several smaller NGOs approached Avery at breakfast, asking for briefings or digital copies of their refugee corridor report. One representative from Amnesty International handed Avery a folded note during the meal. "We believe you. If you need press support, we're watching." Lancaster was visibly rattled. His morning address to the internal team was curt. No smiles, no open floor for questions. He walked out mid-conversation with a junior officer who mentioned scheduling delegate support for a queer youth forum. That same day, Avery received an invitation from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to speak briefly during a side panel on refugee protections. It wasn't part of the official U.S. itinerary, but it was co-sponsored by Canada and the Netherlands, countries that had started to pay attention to the quiet war brewing behind embassy walls. "Just found them outside the venue. You're making the right people nervous." "Then I must be doing something right," Avery replied. Inside the panel room, modest but well-attended, Avery spoke for exactly 9 minutes. They recounted recent field findings, highlighted policy shortcomings, and cited examples of erasure, carefully worded but clear enough for those in the know. Afterward, a Canadian diplomat approached. "We know someone's trying to shut you down," she said quietly. "Your composure says more than any press release. If you're considering next steps, we're open to collaboration." Back at the embassy that evening, Avery received a message slipped under their door. It was typed. "Cease any unauthorized communications outside the scope of your designation. Failure to do so may result in early termination of access." No signature, no header. Avery folded it once, placed it into their notebook, and labeled it Entry 17. They took a deep breath and walked across the hall to the secure computer room. It was time to escalate. Michelle Tang appeared on a secure video call 30 minutes later. Her eyes scanned the document Avery uploaded to the encrypted system. "They're threatening you without a paper trail. That's calculated. We're contacting State's Office of Civil Rights. Keep gathering everything. Don't respond directly to any messages unless you're instructed. We're assigning you a formal liaison." Avery closed their laptop with a steady hand. The next morning, the embassy was buzzing with another layer of tension. Whispers traveled faster than official memos. Lancaster remained mostly hidden in his office. "Just texted. I heard a press inquiry just hit the public affairs desk asking why your name was stripped from the U.S. speaking schedule." Avery replied simply, "Good." By midday, a new face arrived at the embassy: Cara Levy, a legal advisor from the NGO's Geneva office. White, sharp-eyed, and politically seasoned, she walked beside Avery through the halls like a shadow. She requested an immediate meeting with embassy counsel. "We're not here to make threats," Cara told the embassy's legal team, which included Lancaster's deputy. "We're here to clarify legal exposure. If Dr. Bennett's presence is seen as inconvenient, that's a policy choice, but if it's discriminatory exclusion, then we have a different matter on our hands." Avery sat beside her silently, taking notes. The meeting ended without a resolution, but also without denial. That was telling. That evening, Cara met Avery for tea on the rooftop of the residence hall. "They know they've gone too far, they're just hoping to ride it out quietly." "Then we don't let them," Cara smiled. "Exactly. Tomorrow you're going back into the Palais with me, and I want you to sit in the front row during the plenary. No speaking, just your presence. Let them see you." Avery nodded. That night they didn't sleep much. Instead, they revised their documentation log, cleaned up timestamps, labeled witness notes, and finalized a draft memo addressed to State's Office of Civil Rights, CCing their NGO's executive leadership. Entry 24. They stood at the window again just before dawn, staring at the horizon. The water was still, but the air was changing. They were no longer alone. The Palais des Nations had a particular kind of echo when filled with diplomatic silence, the kind of silence that followed policy statements, the kind that absorbed emotion, the kind where every gesture was a signal and every seating chart spoke volumes. That morning, Cara and Avery arrived early. They walked in through the side delegate entrance, bypassing the U.S. cluster entirely. Avery wore a dark suit with a pin that bore both the NGO's logo and the small rainbow triangle they always kept discreetly on their lapel. Cara walked half a step behind, quietly collecting glances from staffers as they made their way to the front of the plenary chamber. They took their seats, front row, far right. Not a word was spoken between them. Avery's expression was calm, almost unreadable. They knew they were being watched, and that was the point. Lancaster entered 10 minutes later, jaw tight, scanning the crowd. His eyes landed on Avery and froze. Cara turned just slightly and gave the most imperceptible of nods. It was enough to send the message, "We're still here." The plenary opened with remarks from the Secretary General. The U.S. ambassador delivered a boilerplate statement about inclusive diplomacy and global cooperation. No one clapped, not really. The real moment came midway through the session. A delegate from Iceland requested a procedural pause to acknowledge the informal but critical contributions of NGOs who have faced obstructions while attending this summit. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The Icelandic representative didn't name names. She didn't have to. Kara leaned over. That was prearranged. Avery smiled just enough to show they understood. As the session closed, reporters waited outside. Kara shielded Avery from the first few questions, but one made it through. Dr. Bennett, do you feel the U.S. delegation has supported your work here? Avery paused. Support is measured by access, and access is the first thing that was taken away. That quote ran the next morning in Le Temps and was picked up by The Guardian. NGOs began resharing Avery's reports. Several tweeted statements of solidarity. One even launched a petition demanding an inquiry into discrimination within diplomatic delegations. That evening, Lancaster called an emergency internal meeting. Jess texted Avery as she left the room. His hands were shaking. But the damage was already done. The next day, Kara delivered a formal complaint to the State Department's Geneva office. Included were logs, timestamps, digital copies of Avery's stripped speaking assignments, and the typed threat letter. The accompanying letter from Michelle Tang demanded a formal investigation. Across the Atlantic, the story reached several congressional offices. One senator, privately allied with LGBTQ+ advocacy circles, issued a public request for clarification regarding allegations of procedural exclusion in Geneva. The statement was carefully worded, but it cracked open a door. Avery continued attending panels, never at the podium but always present. Delegates sought them out in hallways during coffee breaks. Each encounter built something larger than rebuttal. It built narrative, legitimacy, and weight. On the third day after the plenary, a staffer from the Office of the High Commissioner slipped them an envelope. Inside was a printed transcript. A quiet investigation had been opened into the conduct of several embassy staff. Lancaster's name appeared twice. The bottom of the page read, "Confidential, internal review in progress." Avery folded the page carefully, slid it into their notebook behind entry 30. That night, Kara raised a glass at dinner. To being seen, Avery touched their glass to hers. To not disappearing. By the week's end, Lancaster was nowhere to be found. His name was still on the staff list, but he didn't attend briefings. He wasn't seen at sessions. Rumors swirled. One said he'd been called back to D.C., another that he'd taken an unexpected leave. No one confirmed anything, but Avery didn't need confirmation. They knew what accountability looked like. It started slow, like a crack in a polished marble wall, then the fault line deepened, and eventually it split wide open. 2 days after Lancaster's quiet disappearance, the embassy halls felt different. Staff walked with heads high but brows furrowed. There was uncertainty in the air, a cautious hush that replaced the formerly brittle decorum. Kara noticed it immediately, and so did Avery. "This place runs on silence and deference," Kara said over breakfast. "When someone breaks that rhythm, the whole room reorients." Avery nodded. "But we haven't seen the whole shake yet." The Geneva weather had turned warmer. Late April sun streamed through the curtains of Avery's residence room as they updated their logbook. Entry 34. A Canadian envoy had passed them a flash drive containing internal communications between regional diplomats, emails discussing Avery's exclusion with concern and noting Lancaster's name as a recurring issue. The messages didn't confirm anything illegal, but they bolstered the case of coordinated suppression. Each one painted the same pattern: fear of visibility, fear of disruption, and fear of queer leadership in rooms historically built to exclude it. That morning, Kara and Avery met with representatives from the European Parliament's Equality Delegation. Kara presented the complaint timeline while Avery shared first-hand documentation. The diplomats listened intently. "There's precedent for a cross-border ethics referral," said one. "This isn't just about one delegate, it's about diplomatic ecosystems allowing harm." Back at the Palais, Avery was asked to moderate a discussion on NGO government collaboration in refugee response. It wasn't officially sanctioned by the U.S. mission, but it didn't need to be. It was hosted by 3 EU partners, and this time the room was full. As Avery took the mic, they noticed familiar faces: UN observers, Canadian officials, even someone from the British delegation who had once looked away when Lancaster dismissed them. "Advocacy doesn't thrive in polished rooms alone," Avery began. "It thrives when we make space for discomfort and truth." Applause followed, not loud, not flashy, but honest. Later that evening, Avery received a secure message. A senior aide within the State Department had flagged their case for internal review by the Office of the Inspector General. The note was brief. "Confidential, internal review initiated. Your cooperation may be requested." Kara read it twice. "This isn't just about Geneva anymore. This could reach Washington." Jess joined them that night in the courtyard. I've spoken with 3 other staffers who said Lancaster blocked queer or non-traditional delegates in other posts, she said. One in Argentina, another in Nairobi. The third didn't want to go on record, but I've got dates. Start compiling them, Avery said. We're building something that can't be ignored. Michelle Tang arranged a press briefing the next morning. She appeared remotely, her backdrop the NGO's Washington office. Kara sat beside her while Avery remained just out of frame. Our organization stands firmly with Dr. Bennett, Michelle said. This issue is not isolated, it is systemic. We are pursuing every appropriate channel to ensure accountability not only in Geneva, but wherever discrimination is tolerated under diplomatic immunity. The livestream gained traction. Thousands watched. Comments flooded in from advocates, former state employees, and queer professionals. One said, "I was erased from a Peace Corps assignment for coming out. Thank you, Avery." Another, "This happens more than people know. Keep pushing." By the week's end, a congressional staffer reached out requesting an interview with Avery under the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act. Kara coordinated with NGO Legal to arrange the briefing. "This doesn't mean a trial," she warned. "It means the system has to listen. That's different from the system wanting to change." "I know," Avery said, "but hearing is the first crack." Avery spent the weekend preparing testimony. They outlined the first meeting with Lancaster. The stripped credentials, the threats, the erased schedule, they detailed every witness, every document, every moment of calm retaliation. By Sunday night, their logbook had 47 entries. On Monday morning, they received a final anonymous note. It had no signature, just one line typed on official embassy paper. Some walls crack from the inside, others are pushed. Keep pushing. Avery folded it slowly. Then they walked to the window and stared out across Lake Geneva. Change was no longer hypothetical, it was inevitable. The day Avery's whistleblower briefing reached Capitol Hill, the story broke wide. It started with a headline on a mid-tier political news site: "Queer Diplomatic Delegate Faces Systemic Obstruction in Geneva Summit." Within hours, larger outlets picked it up. Kara scrolled through her phone as articles from the Washington Post, Politico, and even NPR flooded in. At the center of them all was Avery's name. Their testimony, redacted but clear, highlighted how a supposedly inclusive diplomatic mission had sidelined them through manipulation, quiet threats, and bureaucratic sabotage. Kara's legal summary backed it up with time-stamped exhibits. Michelle's statement gave it weight, and most importantly, Avery's words gave it soul. By noon, reporters waited outside the embassy gates in Geneva. The press officer offered no comment. Inside, Avery stayed silent. Not because they were scared, but because they knew what silence could mean in the right moment. The silence of composure. The silence that follows a shot fired not in violence but in truth. That afternoon, a group of embassy staffers held a closed-door meeting. Jess attended and later whispered to Avery. 5 people shared similar stories. Lancaster's pattern runs deep. He's not the only one, but he was the most blatant. By evening, Kara received a call from the State Department's Deputy Director of Inclusion. It was short and clipped. "We're aware. We are beginning a full-scale administrative review of internal embassy protocols and individual conduct. We would appreciate continued cooperation." "You'll have it," Kara said, assuming this review is more than lip service. The next day, a message arrived from the Office of the Inspector General. Avery was asked to appear via secure video link to participate in a preliminary oversight hearing. It was not public, not yet, but it was official. Kara sat beside Avery during the call. It lasted nearly 2 hours. Names were named, events recounted, documentation cited. When it ended, Avery felt hollow but clear. They stepped outside into the afternoon light and sat on a bench overlooking the lake. Geneva moved around them like always, clean, controlled, deliberate. But now there was noise beneath the calm. Kara joined them a few minutes later. "Washington's rattled, the story not going away." "Good," Avery said. "It shouldn't." 3 days later, a congressional subcommittee announced it was launching a preliminary inquiry into discrimination within U.S. diplomatic posts. Public hearings would follow. A letter was issued to state demanding all documentation related to Geneva's delegate coordination. Lancaster's name was in bold in the second paragraph. The story became the top item on nightly news. Former diplomats tweeted in support. Advocacy organizations launched open letters. Thousands of signatures poured in demanding better systems of accountability. And still, Avery stayed focused. They returned to the Palais daily. They continued to attend sessions. They responded to delegate requests. They kept updating their log. Entry 58 detailed a conversation with an Australian representative who had once worked under Lancaster in Jakarta. "He forced me off a panel for using gender-inclusive language, told me it was too political. I left 2 years later." Entry 60 captured a quiet moment when an intern from the embassy cafeteria thanked Avery. Because of you, they're talking about us now, not like we're problems, like we matter. On a Friday evening, Kara received confirmation that Lancaster had been placed on administrative leave pending formal investigation. The email was terse, no apology, no fanfare. But it's a beginning, she said. Avery read the line twice. Then they opened their logbook and wrote one final note beneath entry 63. Verified institutional response. First direct consequence, then they closed the book. That night, the embassy hosted a subdued farewell event for one of the junior aides. In the past, Avery might have skipped it, but this time they showed up. Colleagues approached them slowly, then more confidently. A few offered quiet apologies. One staffer, eyes wet, simply said, "I didn't speak up before, I will now." It wasn't perfect, but it was real. When Avery returned to their room, they found a handwritten note slid under their door. No letterhead, no signature, just, "They tried to erase you. Instead, you became permanent." They left it on the desk. Then they turned off the light, took a breath, and let the silence surround them not as absence but as validation. Washington was louder than Geneva. The moment Avery stepped off the plane at Dulles, the city buzzed with the aftershock of everything they had stirred. What began as a silencing effort inside embassy walls had become a national conversation. News segments looped their quote on Access. Hashtags trended. Committees convened. And quietly, offices that once denied them a seat were now requesting their insights. The first stop was Capitol Hill. Avery, dressed in charcoal gray, sat in a private room waiting for the subcommittee hearing to begin. Kara sat beside them, scrolling through notes, occasionally looking up with a small nod of reassurance. Jess had flown in from Geneva and waited in the audience. When Avery's name was called, the room didn't fall silent. It leaned in. They began slowly, clearly, recounting Geneva, the administrative erasure, the denial of access, the subtle aggressions dressed in protocol. They didn't embellish. They didn't dramatize. They documented. Then came the deeper part, the systemic habits that allowed Lancaster and others like him to operate for years. "This isn't about one diplomat," Avery said. "It's about the systems that allow discrimination to be professionalized. What happened to me happens in quieter forms every day, to queer diplomats, to marginalized interns, to contractors, to locals working under flags that promise inclusion." One representative looked down, face unreadable. Another tapped a pen nervously. But the chairperson leaned forward. "And what do you want from us now, Dr. Bennett?" Avery took a breath. "Change the policies, fund the oversight, create anonymous pathways for reporting, train leadership in implicit bias and consequences, not just compliance. And most of all, don't let this fade, not because of me, but because someone else won't get a second chance." The hearing ran for 3 hours. Cameras caught everything. The clip of Avery's final remarks went viral within hours. Later that week, the State Department issued an official statement. "We recognize the failures that allowed discriminatory practices to persist unchecked. We commit to comprehensive reform." Lancaster resigned days later. No press conference, no speech, just a line in a federal notice. Weeks passed. The story dimmed from headlines but burned brighter in policy rooms. Avery was invited to join a new task force on diplomatic inclusivity. Kara continued consulting on similar cases from around the globe. Jess returned to Geneva and began drafting an internal guide for safeguarding marginalized staff, but Avery wasn't finished. They returned to Geneva once more, this time as part of a formal state-backed delegation. They walked back into the Palais des Nations with their badge intact. This time there were no delays at security, no mysterious messages, no exclusion. Instead, they were scheduled to speak on the main stage. Their name was printed clearly on the program. As they stepped to the podium, the room fell silent again, but not with tension, with expectation. "Visibility," Avery began, "is more than being seen. It is being respected, heard, counted, and protected." They spoke for 15 minutes, weaving policy with lived experience, analysis with urgency, and when they finished, the applause was long, real. Afterward, a young intern approached them. "I'm queer," they whispered, hesitant, "and I want to go into diplomacy. I used to think there was no space for me, now I'm not so sure." Avery smiled gently. "There is, and we'll keep making more." Back at the lake that evening, Avery sat alone on the same bench where they'd once updated their log. This time they brought nothing but a book of poetry. The city hummed behind them. Kara texted, "Bill for whistleblower protections in diplomatic posts just cleared committee. Looks good for the floor." Michelle emailed, "Hiring for a new advisory role. Want to help us build it from scratch?" Jess sent a selfie from her new office with a pride flag in the background. Avery closed their eyes and listened to the wind move over the water. They had not sought a war, but they had survived one, and in doing so they had changed the shape of the field for those who would come next. They didn't need a monument, they had the ripple.